After I quit my high-stress corporate job, I bought my dream beach house to heal. On the first night, my mother called to say they were moving in tomorrow, and my dad said it was fine. I just froze. She even added that if I did not like it, I could find somewhere else. My hands shook, but I smiled. They never expected what happened next. My name is Vivian, and I am 34 years old. I operate a highly successful crisis management firm, but my family thinks I am just an unemployed disappointment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, our family projected the perfect image of Black excellence. My parents, Jerome and Brenda, attended every gala and elite church event, making sure everyone knew how successful we appeared. Behind closed doors, their affection was strictly reserved for my older brother, Terrence, the golden child who could do no wrong. I was expected to fall in line and serve the family image. I spent my entire life accommodating their demands until I finally walked away from a soul-crushing executive position to secretly build my own empire. I purchased a stunning oceanfront estate in Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. It was my sanctuary, a place to breathe freely away from their constant judgments. That peace lasted exactly 12 hours. The morning after my mother called, a massive moving truck barreled through my custom wrought iron driveway gates, completely ignoring the security keypad. The screech of metal against metal echoed across the property as the truck crushed the gates inward. I stepped out onto the front porch, holding my coffee mug, watching in absolute disbelief. The passenger door of the truck swung open, and my father stepped out, adjusting his designer sunglasses as if he owned the entire island. My mother followed right behind him, carrying her expensive leather tote bag and looking around with immediate disapproval. Without a single word of greeting, my father marched past me through the front doors. I followed him inside, just in time to see him grab my custom silk throw pillows off the living room sofa and toss them carelessly onto the hallway floor. "Get your stuff out of the master suite, Vivian," he ordered, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. "Lauren's parents are flying in from Aspen for the weekend, and they need the ocean view." Lauren was Terrence's wife. She came from the wealthy Prescott family, and my parents practically worshipped the ground she walked on because of her proximity to generational wealth. I stood in the hallway, staring at the pillows on the floor. I asked my father what he was talking about and why they were not at their estate back in Atlanta, the house they had owned for 30 years. My mother stepped in front of him, sneering as she looked me up and down. "I sold the Atlanta estate last month, Vivian," she said, crossing her arms. "Your brother Terrence needed capital for his new tech merger. Real families make sacrifices for each other. You would not understand that, seeing as you threw away a brilliant corporate career just to find yourself." She used her fingers to make air quotes around "find yourself," her face twisting with raw contempt. "You should be grateful we are letting you stay here under our roof while you figure out whatever little phase you are going through." I looked at the two of them standing in the foyer of a multi-million-dollar home that I had purchased entirely in cash. They assumed Terrence had bought this estate. He had clearly lied to them, taking credit for my property to cover up his own financial disasters. Instead of screaming or demanding they leave, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the exact dynamic that had suffocated me my entire life. Terrence makes a massive mess, and I am expected to surrender my space, my comfort, and my hard-earned peace to fix it. My mother tapped her foot impatiently. "Well, go on," she demanded, pointing toward the stairs. "Start moving your things to the pool house. We have caterers arriving tomorrow, and I need this place spotless before the Prescotts get here. Do not embarrass your brother this weekend, Vivian." I took a slow, deep breath. I walked past them up the sweeping staircase and into the master suite. I calmly packed a small overnight bag with my essentials. I did not shed a single tear. When I came back downstairs, my father was already directing the movers on where to place their antique furniture. I reached into my bag and pulled out a clipboard holding a legal document. "Since you are staying here, I need you to sign this." "Dad," I said, keeping my tone completely flat. "It is a neighborhood liability waiver." The Homeowners Association requires all guests to sign it due to the strict noise and property ordinances in Oak Bluffs. My father snatched the clipboard from my hands without even glancing at the text. "You are always so caught up in ridiculous paperwork," he muttered, scrawling his signature aggressively across the bottom line. "You need to learn how to relax, Vivian." He shoved the clipboard back at my chest. I looked down at his signature. The ink was perfectly legible on the final page of a binding month-to-month lease agreement that designated my corporate entity as the landlord and him as a tenant, with a $50,000 penalty clause for any criminal activity on the premises. Right as I secured the document, a sleek black leased luxury SUV pulled into the driveway, stopping inches from the ruined gates. The doors opened, and Terrence stepped out wearing a designer suit that I knew he could not afford. Lauren stepped out from the passenger side, adjusting her oversized sunglasses and looking at my house with hungry eyes. The parasites had fully arrived. I smiled tightly at my parents and walked out the back door toward the pool house. Let them get comfortable, I thought to myself. The higher they climb, the harder they are going to fall. I watched as the heavy doors of the luxury vehicle swung open. Terrence stepped onto the crushed stone of the driveway wearing a tailored suit that strained across his shoulders. He surveyed the expansive front lawn and the wraparound porch with a look of intense satisfaction, as if he had built the entire estate with his own bare hands. He did not look at me with the warmth of a brother who had not seen his sister in months. Instead, his eyes carried the familiar, arrogant gleam that my parents had spent his entire life nurturing. He walked up the steps, pulled the heavy key fob from his pocket, and tossed it casually in my direction. "Park this in the shade, sister," he said without breaking his stride. "And be careful with the rims because I just had them detailed." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his demand, the passenger side door opened. Lauren emerged carefully, placing her designer sandals onto the driveway. She wore a pristine white sundress that screamed country club royalty and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her eyes from the coastal sun. She was the heir to the Prescott family fortune, and she never let anyone forget it. She glided up the stairs behind my brother, pausing only when she noticed me standing by the door holding the keys for him. Her gaze swept over me, moving slowly from my bare feet up to my unbranded cashmere loungewear. Because there were no visible designer logos, she instantly assumed it was cheap. A small condescending smile formed on her lips as she adjusted her posture to look down at me. "Oh, Vivian," she said, using a high-pitched, pitying tone that grated against my ears. "Terrence told me you are unemployed now. It is so brave of you to just give up like that. Most people would be terrified to lose their corporate income, but you have always marched to the beat of your own drum." I tightened my grip on the key fob, feeling the cold metal press into my palm. "I did not give up, Lauren," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level so she could not detect my annoyance. "I transitioned into private consulting and took some time away from the city. I am doing exactly what I want to be doing right now." She tilted her head, looking at me with absolute tragic sympathy, as if I were a charity case she had stumbled upon in the street. "Of course you did, sweetie," she murmured, stepping closer. "But you do not have to put on a brave face for us. We are family, and we know how hard things have been for you. In fact, my dad is coming this weekend to meet with Terrence about his new tech merger. Richard knows everyone in Boston and Atlanta. Do not worry. Maybe he can find you a receptionist job at his firm. They are always looking for diverse hires to answer the phones. It would be a great way to get you back on your feet and give you a sense of purpose again. You really need some structure in your life, Vivian." The front door swung open, and my mother stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a fresh dish towel. She had heard the entire exchange through the open windows. Instead of defending her daughter against a blatant insult, she immediately aligned herself with the white wealth she so desperately craved to be associated with. "Vivian is just grateful we let her stay here while she figures her life out." My mother chimed in, placing a warm hand on Lauren's shoulder. "We are hoping the island air clears her head. She has always struggled with focus and direction. Not like our Terrence, who always knows exactly what he wants." "Go on inside, Lauren, honey. I had the movers place your bags in the ocean view suite where you will be most comfortable." I stood there on the porch as the three of them walked into my home laughing together like the perfect successful family. They did not know the house belonged to me. They did not know the cashmere I was wearing cost more than the lease on their luxury vehicle. They thought I was a broken failure seeking refuge in the shadow of my brother's fake success. I smiled sharply, letting the insult wash over me without leaving a mark. I took the keys and walked down the steps toward the hot sun beating down on the driveway. I got into the vehicle and drove it carefully around the side of the house, parking it in the exact spot Terrence had demanded. The leather seat smelled like expensive cologne in desperation, but I ignored it. I stepped out of the car and locked the doors, listening to the sharp chirp of the alarm system echo across the yard. I walked across the manicured grass toward the pool house. It was a spacious structure with vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Atlantic Ocean. It was meant to be a quiet guest retreat, but for now, it was my private command center. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and closed the motorized blinds, plunging the room into a cool, shadowy dimness that felt instantly soothing. I sat down at the glass desk and opened my encrypted laptop. The screen glowed to life, demanding a series of biometric verifications and complex passwords before granting me access. I bypassed the security protocols of my crisis public relations network and accessed a highly restricted private database used only by elite corporate investigators. My family actually thought Terrence was a brilliant venture capitalist, securing millions for a historic tech merger. They thought he was the ultimate golden child sent to elevate our family name into the upper echelons of high society. I typed his full legal name into the secure search query, followed by his corporate tax identification numbers and his recent banking histories. I hit enter and watched as the blue loading bar flashed quickly across the screen, compiling years of hidden financial data. I pulled up a deep background check on my brother's so-called tech merger to finally see the unvarnished truth. I needed to know exactly how much money he had stolen from Richard Prescott. The digital files began to populate on my monitor. What I found was worse than I had ever imagined. Terrence was not building a real legacy. He was constructing a massive house of cards that was about to completely collapse directly onto all of them very soon indeed. It was Friday morning, and the coastal fog was just beginning to lift. I sat staring at the illuminated screen of my laptop, tracing the digital footprints of my brother's glorious tech merger. I was just pulling up the shareholder registry for a shell firm tied directly to the Prescott Family Trust when the heavy oak door of the pool house slammed open, hitting the wall with a violent thud. My mother marched into the room without knocking, wearing a pristine tennis outfit. She took one look at me, sitting at the desk in my silk robe, and sneered. Before I could speak, she reached down and ripped the power cord directly out of the wall socket. The battery backup kicked in instantly, keeping my screens active, but the sheer disrespect made my jaw tighten. I closed the lid quickly, securing the encrypted files. "I need you up and moving right now, Vivian," my mother commanded, placing her hands on her hips. "Lauren's parents are flying in from Aspen this evening, and they will be here by dinner time. You need to get into that kitchen and start cooking. They want a traditional Southern meal, authentic soul food, and I am not about to let you embarrass your brother in front of his wealthy in-laws. They need to see that this family respects its roots, even if Terrence is the only one who made something of himself." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I am not cooking dinner for the Prescotts, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice completely flat. "I have my own work to do today. You have an entire caterer's kitchen in the main house. Hire a private chef or cook the meal yourself." My mother's face turned a dark shade of crimson. Her eyes widened in genuine shock at my refusal because in her world, my only purpose was to serve the golden child. Before she could launch into a tirade, a large shadow fell over the doorway. My father stepped into the pool house, blocking the morning light. He had clearly followed my mother down from the main estate, waiting in the wings to enforce her demands, just like he always did when we were growing up. "You will do exactly as your mother says." "Vivian!" My father barked, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "You are living under your brother's roof entirely on his charity. You do not pay rent and you do not contribute anything to this family name. If you refuse to earn your keep and help Terrence shine this weekend, I will personally pack your bags and throw your belongings out onto the street. You can figure out how to survive out there with no job and no ambition. I looked at my father, feeling a strange mix of pity and absolute disgust. He was threatening to throw me out of a multi-million-dollar estate that I had purchased in cash. Part of me wanted to pull the deed from my desk drawer and watch the arrogance drain from his face. But reacting with emotion would ruin everything. I needed them to feel completely secure in their false reality before the impact finally took hold. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my robe. I looked directly into my father's eyes, offering a tight, compliant smile that I knew would satisfy his need for control. "Fine," I said softly, keeping my tone carefully measured. "I will cook dinner for the Prescotts tonight." I walked past them toward the open door, but paused just as I crossed the threshold. "I hope Mr. Prescott's dietary restrictions are as flexible as his investment strategies," I added over my shoulder. My father scoffed, waving his hand in dismissal. "Do not try to sound smart, Vivian," he muttered, shaking his head. "You know nothing about corporate investments. Just focus on not burning the roast." I walked across the manicured lawn toward the main house, feeling the damp grass beneath my bare feet. When I entered the massive gourmet kitchen, the silence was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. The room was my pride and joy, featuring double marble islands and a professional-grade stove. I tied a heavy linen apron around my waist and began gathering the ingredients I had ordered earlier in the week. Fresh collard greens, massive sweet potatoes, thick cuts of beef ribs, and a colorful array of spices soon covered the counter. I washed the greens methodically, tearing the leaves from the bitter stems. The physical act of washing and chopping the vegetables was grounding. The rhythmic sound of the heavy chef's knife hitting the wooden cutting board helped me organize my chaotic thoughts. I set a large cast-iron pot on the stove and let the aromatics begin to sizzle in the hot oil. The smell of onions and garlic filled the warm air perfectly, masking the bitter scent of my family's unbelievable entitlement. I knew this meal would be the last one I ever cooked for them. Tomorrow their grand illusion would shatter completely. But tonight they would eat incredibly well and learn the truth. As I worked, I reached into the deep pocket of my robe and pulled out a tiny discreet earpiece. I slipped it into my right ear, making sure it was hidden beneath my hair. I tapped the side of the device twice to activate the encrypted communication line. I kept my head down, expertly slicing the sweet potatoes into perfect uniform rounds as the line clicked and connected securely. "Boss," the voice of Marcus, my lead. Corporate investigator crackled softly but clearly in my ear. He had been working through the night alongside me, following the digital breadcrumbs I had assigned to his team. "I am here, Marcus," I murmured, keeping my voice low and steady as I moved the sweet potatoes into a large glass bowl. "What did you find in the Delaware registry regarding the holding companies?" There was a heavy pause on the secure line before he spoke again, and the grim tone of his voice made my hands stop moving entirely. "Boss, your brother's company is a complete shell," he said, his words sharp and urgent echoing in my ear. "There is no tech merger happening anywhere. The patents he claimed to hold do not exist, and the offshore accounts are bleeding money to pay off the early investors. He is running a massive Ponzi scheme, and from what I can see on these master ledgers, Richard Prescott is his primary mark. He is about to drain the Prescott family trust completely dry." "Keep pulling the ledgers, Marcus," I whispered, turning off the burner beneath the heavy cast iron pot. "Send every single document to my secure server and do not let anyone know we are looking into this." I tapped my earpiece to end the connection and stood perfectly still in the massive kitchen, breathing in the heavy scent of roasted meat and savory spices. My own brother was a con artist, and he was using my home as the staging ground for his final illusion. I looked out the kitchen window at the sweeping ocean view, feeling a cold and absolute clarity settle over my entire body. Terrence had always been reckless with his finances, but this was entirely different. This was federal fraud, and he had entangled my parents right in the middle of it. I wiped down the marble counters, making sure every surface was immaculate. The food was ready, perfectly plated in expensive ceramic dishes, serving as the ultimate prop for my family's delusion. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the quiet evening air. I walked toward the front hallway, staying out of sight as a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled to a stop in front of the portico. Terrence and Lauren burst through the front doors like a pair of eager actors hitting their marks on a stage. My parents were close behind them, my father aggressively smoothing the lapels of his suit, while my mother adjusted her pearl necklace, trying desperately to project an image of generational wealth. The driver opened the back doors of the sedan, and Richard Prescott stepped out into the fading sunlight. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of casual, arrogant posture that only comes from decades of unquestioned authority. His wife Diane followed right behind him, wearing a beige cashmere wrap and looking around the property with a tight, assessing smile. Lauren threw her arms around her father's neck, squealing with delight. "Welcome to the vineyard, Daddy," she sang, her voice echoing through the open doors. "Is it not absolutely stunning? Terrence just closed on it last month." Diane placed a hand over her heart, looking up at the vaulted ceilings of my grand foyer. "Oh, Terrence, it is magnificent," she cooed, stepping inside and running her fingers along the custom wainscoting I had personally selected. "It is so wonderful to see young people building such a strong foundation. You must be so proud, Jerome." My father puffed out his chest, looking around my house as if he had laid every single brick himself. "We are incredibly proud, Diane," he boasted, his voice deep and resonant. "Terrence has always understood the value of Black excellence. He bought this estate for Brenda and me so we could have a peaceful retirement. It is exactly what we dreamed of when we raised him." My mother nodded, linking her arm proudly through my father's. "Yes, our son takes very good care of us," she added softly, her eyes shining with fake emotion. "It is a true blessing to have a boy who honors his family this way." I stood just inside the kitchen doorway, listening to them steal my hard-earned accomplishments to pad my brother's fraudulent resume. Lauren took her parents by the arms and began leading them through the house, pointing out the imported hardwood floors and the custom lighting fixtures, as if Terrence had spent hours agonizing over the architectural details. They walked through the formal dining room and finally stepped into the expansive kitchen where I was standing by the island, wearing my dark linen apron. Richard Prescott stopped in his tracks and inhaled deeply, looking around the room with intense approval. "Something smells incredible," Richard boomed, rubbing his hands together. He looked directly at me, his eyes sliding over my apron and my simple clothes. You must be the hired help," he said, addressing me with the loud, slow tone people use when they assume they are speaking to someone completely beneath them. "Terrence, my boy, you really went all out hiring a private chef for the weekend. What is on the menu tonight, sweetheart?" The kitchen went completely silent. I looked at my brother, waiting to see if he would correct the man whose money he was actively stealing. Terrence just swallowed hard and looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I turned my gaze to my mother and father, waiting for them to claim their daughter. Instead, my mother stepped forward with a tight, strained smile. "Yes, she is a tremendous help to us," Brenda said, her voice dripping with raw condescension. "She is a local girl we brought in to handle the domestic tasks for the weekend. We wanted everything to be perfect for your arrival, Richard." My father cleared his throat, stepping eagerly to Richard's side. "Vivian, be a good girl and fetch Mr. Prescott's luggage from the driveway," he ordered, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Take their bags up to the Ocean View suite and make sure you do not scuff the walls on your way up. We will be having dinner in 30 minutes, so make sure the table is properly set." I looked at the four of them standing there, completely willing to strip away my identity just to preserve their pathetic lie. I did not scream or throw the wooden spoon I was holding. I simply nodded, offering Richard Prescott a polite, empty smile. "Right away, sir," I said, keeping my voice soft and subservient. "Let me get those bags for you." I untied my apron, leaving it on the marble counter, and walked past them out the front door. The evening air was cool against my skin, as I approached the silver sedan. The driver had already unloaded 3 heavy leather suitcases and a structured leather briefcase, leaving them neatly arranged on the crushed stone. I picked up the 2 smaller bags and slung the heavy briefcase over my shoulder as I walked back toward the house. The leather of the briefcase was worn and supple, clearly expensive, but the main zipper was partially caught on a piece of silk fabric inside. As I shifted the awkward weight of the heavy bags, the zipper gaped open wider, shifting the contents of the briefcase. An elegant navy blue folder slid upward, catching the fading evening light, illuminating the metallic print. I stopped walking completely, frozen on the bottom step of my own front porch, staring down at the exposed documents. Embossed on the thick cardstock of the folder was a very specific gold logo. It was the crest of Vanguard Sterling Bank, one of the most elite financial institutions on the East Coast. They were not just any bank. They were the primary corporate client of my crisis management firm. I had spent the last 3 years personally handling their public relations, shielding their investments, and managing their executive fallout. Richard Prescott was carrying a highly confidential Vanguard Sterling dossier directly related to Terrence's shell company. I stood there in the twilight, feeling the heavy weight of the luggage pulling at my shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent clarity. Terrence was not just scamming Richard Prescott. Richard Prescott was using Vanguard Sterling funds to finance the fraudulent merger, which meant my brother was about to trigger a massive federal investigation into my biggest client. I pushed the folder back down into the briefcase and zipped it shut, my mind working 100 miles a minute. They wanted me to be the hired help this weekend. I smiled, walking up the stairs with the bags. They had absolutely no idea how efficiently the help could dismantle their entire world. I walked up the grand staircase carrying the heavy luggage, my bare feet sinking into the plush runner. The weight of Richard Prescott's briefcase pulling at my shoulder was nothing compared to the weight of what I had just discovered inside it. The Vanguard Sterling logo was burned into my retinas. I knew the executives at that bank personally. I knew their risk management team, and I knew their fraud protocols. They did not hand out $2 million wire transfers to unverified shell companies without significant airtight collateral. Terrence had to have forged documents or pledged an asset he did not possess. The sheer audacity of his crime was breathtaking. He was playing Russian roulette with federal investigators, and he had invited the victims right into my dining room. I arranged the bags in the master suite, hanging the heavy wool coats precisely as ordered, making sure the pristine facade of the hired help was maintained. When I returned to the kitchen, the air was thick with the rich aroma of braised beef, sweet potatoes, and roasted garlic. I moved methodically, transferring the food into the imported ceramic serving dishes I had purchased in Italy years ago, wiping the edges clean, wiping away the metaphorical fingerprints of the actual owner of this estate. The dining room was a theater of the absurd. The long mahogany table was set with heavy crystal glasses, polished silver, and fine linen napkins. Terrence sat at the head, looking like a king presiding over his loyal subjects. Richard and Diane sat to his right, exuding the casual arrogance of people who believed their money made them untouchable. My parents sat to his left, practically vibrating with the desperate need to belong to this world. Lauren hovered near Terrence, her hand constantly touching his arm, playing the devoted fiancé of a billionaire genius. I brought the platters out one by one, placing them silently on the table. My father did not even look at me when I served his plate. My mother actively turned her head away, engaging Diane in a conversation about local charities she had never actually donated to. I was a ghost in my own home, a specter of failure. They were actively trying to hide from their wealthy guests. When all the food was served, Terrence gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table. "Sit, Vivian," he commanded, his voice carrying that faux generosity that always made my skin crawl. "You worked hard preparing this meal. You can join us down there. Just keep quiet while the adults talk business." I took my seat at the end of the table, pulling my chair out with deliberate slowness. The physical distance between me and the rest of them was intentional. a visual representation of how far I had supposedly fallen from their graces. Lauren laughed, a high-pitched tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. She leaned into Diane, shaking her head. "He is too good to her," Lauren whispered, though she intended for everyone to hear. "It is a shame she does not appreciate what he does for this family." My mother Brenda set her wineglass down with a tragic sigh. "She was always the family failure," Brenda announced loudly, ensuring Richard and Diane heard every word. "She had so much potential. Dropping out of the corporate world like that, throwing away a perfectly good education because the real world was too difficult for her. Now she just floats from place to place, relying entirely on her brother's charity. It is humiliating, frankly, to have a child who refuses to apply herself, while Terrence builds an empire she cannot even hold down a real job." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, listening to the woman who gave birth to me systematically destroy my character for the amusement of strangers. I watched my father nod solemnly in agreement, cutting his meat with aggressive precision. "We tried to raise her right," Jerome added gruffly. "But some people are just born without ambition. Terrence got all the drive in this family." Richard Prescott wiped his mouth with his napkin, pointing his fork at my brother. "The food is fantastic, but let's discuss something even better than a good meal," he said, his voice booming with authority. "Terrence, my boy, investing $2 million into your platform was the best decision I made this year. My financial advisors were hesitant about a tech startup, but I told them I saw pure, unregulated genius in you. I saw a man who understands the future of digital integration." The entire table hung on his every word. My parents looked like they were ascending to heaven, their faces glowing with immense pride. Lauren practically swooned, gazing at Terrence like he was a deity. "I am eager to see the tangible results." Richard continued swirling the dark wine in his glass. "You promised a revolutionary return margin on that initial seed funding. Tell me, son, when exactly do I see the Q3 returns?" I focused entirely on my brother, watching the micro-expressions play across his face. The golden child, the supposed billionaire, was currently experiencing a massive internal panic. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second. His left hand gripped his napkin so tightly his knuckles turned white beneath the table. He was sweating, an imperceptible sheen forming on his forehead under the crystal chandelier. He was lying to a man who could destroy him with a single phone call. "The returns are exceeding all our models, Richard." Terrence lied smoothly, forcing his voice to remain deep and relaxed. "Our development team is entering the final stage of beta testing, and the preliminary financial reports will be issued by the end of next month. The market capture is even stronger than we projected." Richard laughed loudly, a booming sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Outstanding!" he declared, raising his glass to Terrence. "That is exactly what I like to hear." Lauren turned her gaze down the long table, finding me sitting quietly at the end. Her eyes were cold and sharp, filled with the kind of cruelty that only comes from deep-seated insecurity. She offered a slow, mocking smirk, tilting her head. "See, Vivian?" she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "That is how real wealth is made. You have to be bold, you have to take risks, and you have to possess the intellect to execute a massive vision. You do not get to this level by baking or doing whatever little domestic hobby you claim to do now. Maybe if you paid closer attention, you could learn a thing or two from your brother instead of just serving him dinner." My mother nodded fervently, leaning toward Diane. "We pray for her every day," Brenda whispered loudly. "But some people are just meant to be followers. They lack the fundamental capacity for greatness." The sheer audacity of their performance was intoxicating. They were so deeply entrenched in their false reality that they had completely blinded themselves to the truth. They were feasting in my house, eating the food I bought, drinking the wine I selected, and insulting me to impress a man whose money was actively being stolen by their perfect son. I reached forward and wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem of my wineglass. The crystal felt cool against my skin. I lifted it to my lips, taking a slow, measured sip, the rich, complex flavors blooming on my tongue. The dining room was filled with the sounds of their self-congratulatory chatter, the clinking of silverware, the soft laughter of people who believed they had won the game of life. I set the glass back down, the quiet clink echoing with finality. I leaned my forearms against the polished mahogany table, letting my eyes lock onto Terrence. Real wealth requires real collateral. Terrence, I said, my voice low and perfectly calm, slicing through the joyful noise like a razor blade. The table went dead silent. The laughter died in Lauren's throat. My mother froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. My father scowled, ready to reprimand me for speaking out of turn, but I did not look at them. My gaze was fixed entirely on my brother, watching the blood drain from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell. "Tell me, Terrence." I continued, my tone conversational but laced with lethal precision. "What exactly did you leverage to guarantee Mr. Prescott's $2 million? Terrence's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes widened in absolute terror. The smooth, confident tech mogul vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered animal. He tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. My parents stared at him, waiting for him to laugh it off, to put his crazy sister back in her place. But they saw the panic spreading across his features, the uncontrollable tremor in his jaw. Richard Prescott lowered his glass, frowning deeply, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "Terrence, what is she talking about?" he asked, the jovial warmth completely gone from his voice. "The bank handled the collateral guarantee through your primary holding firm." I kept my eyes glued to Terrence's sweating face. "Vanguard Sterling Bank requires physical, tangible assets for a transfer of that magnitude. Mr. Prescott?" I said, my voice echoing in the stifling silence. "So I will ask you again, brother. What physical asset did you pledge to the bank? Because you do not own this house. You do not own the cars parked in the driveway, and according to the Delaware Corporate Registry, you do not even own the name of your own company." It was the exact reaction I was waiting for. Terrence stared at me, his jaw working silently as the color completely washed out of his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in the candlelight. The silence in the dining room stretched so thin it felt like a wire about to snap. Richard Prescott shifted his heavy frame in his chair, his eyes darting between my brother and me, a deep crease forming between his thick silver eyebrows. My mother was the first to recover her lifelong training in ignoring reality, kicking in with flawless precision. She let out a shrill, forced laugh that echoed too loudly against the mahogany walls. "Oh, Vivian, please stop with your little conspiracy theories," Brenda said, waving her hand dismissively as she reached for her wine glass. "Richard, you must forgive her. She reads these ridiculous financial blogs online and thinks she is some kind of corporate spy. It is honestly embarrassing how she tries to insert herself into business conversations she knows absolutely nothing about. Terrence owns everything you see here. Do not let her jealous delusions ruin a wonderful evening." Terrence cleared his throat, seizing the lifeline my mother had thrown him. "Yes, of course," he stammered, a nervous smile stretching across his face. Vivian has always struggled with reality, especially since her little baking business went under. It is a sad situation, really, but we try to humor her. The assets are fully secured. Richard, the paperwork is locked down tight. Richard did not look entirely convinced, his sharp, predatory eyes lingering on Terrence's sweating forehead, but Diane gently touched her husband's arm, changing the subject to their upcoming charity gala, sparing my brother from further interrogation. I stood up slowly, picking up the empty serving platters. I offered one last look at Terrence, letting him see the absolute certainty in my eyes, before I turned and walked back into the kitchen. I did not need to push the issue any further at the dinner table. The seed of doubt had been planted deep in Richard Prescott's mind, and I knew my brother well enough to know he would panic. The dinner concluded in a thick, tense atmosphere, and I spent the next 2 hours quietly washing dishes and polishing the granite countertops, playing the role of the invisible hired help, while my family escorted their wealthy guests up to the master suite. The house finally fell silent around midnight. the heavy oak doors closing as the guests retreated to their bedrooms. I slipped off my apron, leaving it folded neatly over the back of a kitchen chair, and walked barefoot down the long, darkened hallway toward the west wing of the estate. I knew Terence would not be able to sleep. The pressure of my accusation combined with Richard's sudden demand for quarterly returns would be eating him alive. I moved silently over the plush rugs, my steps making no sound as I approached the heavy double doors of the private study. I noticed a sliver of warm yellow light spilling out from beneath the doorframe and heard the frantic, hushed whispers of my brother and my father. I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, inching closer to the slight gap between the double doors. The study was my favorite room in the house, featuring floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive cherry wood desk. Terence was pacing frantically in front of the fireplace, running his hands through his hair, while Jerome sat heavily in one of the leather armchairs holding a crystal glass of bourbon. "Dad, you have to sign this right now," Terence hissed, his voice trembling with unchecked panic. "Prescott is getting suspicious. Vivian nearly blew the whole thing tonight with her crazy stunt. I need to show him a massive dividend payment by tomorrow morning, or he is going to pull his funding and demand an audit. If he audits the shell accounts, I am going to federal prison." Jerome looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished surface of the desk. He rubbed his temples, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. "Terence, this is madness," Jerome muttered, shaking his head. "You are asking me to sign as a guarantor on a $3 million bridge loan from an offshore lender. The interest rates are completely predatory. If this merger does not go through exactly as you planned, we will lose everything. This is not just corporate money you are playing with anymore. This is my retirement, my legacy." Terence stopped pacing and slammed his hands down on the desk, leaning over our father with a look of desperate manipulation. "Dad, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dropping into that smooth, persuasive tone he always used to get exactly what he wanted. "There is no risk here. The tech merger is happening. I just need this bridge loan to float the Q3 returns to Prescott to keep him happy for one more month. Once his trust releases the rest of the capital, I pay back the bridge loan and we walk away. Billionaires. But I cannot secure this loan without collateral." Jerome stared at the papers, picking up the heavy gold pen but hesitating. "Terence, what collateral are you using?" "This house," Terence said quickly, the lie rolling off his tongue with sickening ease. "I put the deed to this estate up as the primary collateral. The lenders just need your signature as the co-signer since you are listed as a secondary managing partner on my holdings." My father froze the pen, hovering inches above the signature line. "Terence, you cannot mortgage this house," Jerome argued, his voice rising slightly in panic. "This is our family home. You bought this for your mother and me to secure our future. If something goes wrong, we will be out on the street." I watched through this crack in the doors as Terence played his final card, leaning into the decades of conditioning my parents had subjected themselves to. "Dad, look at me." Terence commanded, his voice firm and filled with righteous indignation. "I am the only one carrying this family name. I am the only one building an empire here. Who else is going to secure your future? Vivian, do you really want to rely on that deadbeat sister of mine? She dropped out of the corporate world to bake bread. Dad, she is a failure, serving food to my guests in an apron. I am the golden child. I am the one who made us somebody in this world. You have to trust me. Sign the paper. Dad, show me you believe in your son." Jerome looked at Terence, the manipulation sinking its claws deep into his ego-driven mind. The fear in his eyes slowly morphed into a stubborn, misguided pride. He looked down at the document, seeing not a fraudulent loan, but a testament to his son's supposed genius. He believed the lie, because the alternative, acknowledging that his golden boy was a criminal and his discarded daughter was right, was simply too painful to bear. Jerome gripped the pen tightly and pressed the nib to the paper, signing his name with a series of quick, jagged strokes. There, he breathed heavily, sliding the documents back across the desk. "We are in this together, son. Make us proud." Terrence snatched the papers up, clutching them to his chest, with a massive sigh of relief. "You will not regret this, Dad," he promised, slipping the documents into a leather folder. "Tomorrow morning, we lock in the bridge loan, and by the weekend we celebrate the biggest win of our lives." I stood in the dark hallway, the cold reality of what I had just witnessed washing over me, like a wave of ice water. My brother had just manipulated my father into signing a fraudulent bridge loan, using my house as collateral. Neither Terrence nor Jerome owned this estate. The deed they had submitted to the offshore lender was a complete forgery. They had crossed the line from a simple Ponzi scheme into federal wire fraud and identity theft, and they had documented the entire crime in writing. I stepped away from the door, retreating silently down the hallway until I was safely back in the kitchen. I pulled my phone from the deep pocket of my trousers, the screen illuminating my face in the dark. I opened my secure messaging app and pulled up the encrypted thread with my lead corporate attorney, David, who had been monitoring the situation remotely all week. I stared at the screen, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. My family had chosen their path. My father had willingly signed away his integrity just to validate his son's. Delusion. They thought they were outsmarting the system, but they had just handed me the final nail in their coffin. I typed the message with cold, precise movements, feeling the finality of the words. Target acquired. I typed, hitting send without a single ounce of hesitation. They just executed a forged deed for a bridge loan. Freeze the LLC assets, immediately initiate the kill switch for Vanguard Sterling. The message sent a tiny checkmark appearing on the screen, indicating it had been securely received. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket, looking out the kitchen window at the dark ocean. My family thought tomorrow would be the day they secured their grand empire. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow was the day the illusion would burn to the ground completely, and I was going to watch every single second of it. I watched Terrence storm out of the pool house, kicking a teak lounge chair into the water in his blind rage, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. I knew exactly what he had to do next to save his precious yacht trip, with his bank accounts frozen solid and his shell company under federal lockdown. He had to scramble to the deepest, darkest corners of his contact list to find $10,000 in raw cash. He must have found a bottom feeder willing to front him the money at an extortionate rate, because by 2:00 that afternoon, we were standing on the sun-drenched docks of the marina, approaching the gleaming white hull of a massive luxury catamaran. The afternoon sun reflected blindly off the pristine water as the crew welcomed the Prescott family aboard. Richard and Diane walked up the ramp with the casual entitlement of people who spent half their lives on the ocean, while my parents followed closely behind them, wearing brand new resort wear that still had the stiff creases of a rushed purchase. Jerome was aggressively adjusting his nautical-themed polo shirt, while Brenda teetered on wedge heels that were entirely inappropriate for a boat deck. Lauren clung to Terrence's arm, practically skipping up the ramp, her designer sunglasses pushed back into her hair. Terrence looked like a man walking to his own execution, his skin pale beneath the harsh sunlight, his eyes constantly darting to his phone, which he clutched in his hand like a lifeline. As soon as we boarded, my mother turned to me, her eyes narrowing with characteristic disdain. She did not want me there ruining her aesthetic, but she needed someone to play the role of the subservient help to complete their illusion of generational wealth. "Go down to the galley, Vivian," she ordered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the lower deck. "The crew has the catering arranged, but I want you handling the beverage service. Do not let Mr. Prescott's glass go empty, and try to stay out of the way when the adults are conversing. We do not need you hovering over us, looking miserable." I walked down the narrow teak stairs into the cool, air-conditioned galley, my face a mask of serene compliance. The boat engines rumbled to life beneath my feet, sending a deep vibration through the floorboards as the captain steered the massive vessel out of the harbor into the open ocean. I found the ice buckets and the expensive bottles of vintage champagne Terrence had ordered. I arranged crystal flutes on a heavy silver tray, pouring the bubbling golden liquid with steady, practiced hands. The trap was already set and closing tighter by the minute. I just needed to stand back and watch them drown. When I carried the heavy silver tray up to the main deck, the ocean breeze caught my hair, whipping it around my face. The family was lounging on the plush, white, semicircular seating area at the stern of the boat, basking in the warm sun. Richard was smoking a thick cigar, holding court, while Terence sat rigidly beside him, laughing a fraction of a second too late. At every joke, Lauren was draped over a sunbed, holding out her empty hand expectantly as I approached. I lowered the tray, offering her a fresh glass of champagne. Lauren took it without looking at me, taking a small sip before dramatically curling her lip in disgust. She set the crystal flute down on the small acrylic table with a sharp clack, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, Vivian, this is completely unacceptable." Lauren complained, her voice loud enough to carry over the sound of the ocean wind and the rushing water. "The champagne is barely chilled. You poured too much foam and the glass is sticky on the outside. It is really not that difficult to serve a simple beverage. I do not understand how you manage to mess up the easiest tasks. Terence pays entirely too much for this kind of sloppy service." Brenda immediately jumped in, eager to demonstrate her authority over the hired help in front of Diane Prescott. She leaned forward, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered embarrassment burning in her eyes. "Why can you not be useful for once in your life, Vivian?" Brenda scolded, her voice sharp and biting. "You are embarrassing us in front of our guests. Take that entire tray back down to the galley and start over. And wash your hands before you touch the clean glasses. You are completely hopeless. It is a tragedy how you refuse to apply yourself even to the most basic domestic chores." I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I simply nodded, bowing my head in mock subservience, keeping my eyes fixed on the silver tray. "Yes, ma'am," I said softly, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "I will replace these immediately. Let me just clear Mr. Prescott's empty glass first." I stepped closer to the seating area, moving directly toward the small table situated between Richard and Terence. Terence had placed his phone face up on the polished surface, his hand resting nervously inches away from it. I reached across the table, pretending to lose my balance, as the boat hit a minor swell in the ocean water. I let my wrist dip just a fraction of an inch, tilting the heavy silver tray. The tall crystal flute tipped over, sending a cascading waterfall of sticky, chilled champagne directly onto Terence's phone. The liquid splashed across the dark screen, instantly waking the device up. I gasped, offering a quiet, entirely fake apology as I scrambled to wipe up the mess. But I was moving intentionally slow. Terence let out a strangled yell, lunging forward to snatch his phone from the puddle of champagne, but he was too late. The bright screen illuminated perfectly in the afternoon sun, displaying a text message notification that took up the entire upper half of the display. The font was large, the words undeniable. The message was from a contact saved simply as Mick. It read, "Listen to me, you pathetic fraud. You have exactly 4 hours to wire the $20,000 payback for the yacht deposit, or my guys are coming to that marina to break both your legs. You do not ignore my calls." Richard Prescott was sitting right there, leaning forward to tap his cigar ash into a tray when the screen lit up. His sharp, predatory eyes locked onto the glowing text message, reading the violent threat, clear as day. The casual, relaxed posture of the billionaire instantly vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a man who realized he was sitting next to a desperate liar. Terence snatched the phone up, shoving it deep into his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it twice. He looked up, his face draining of all blood, leaving him looking sickly and gray. He let out a breathless, panicked laugh, looking frantically at Richard. "It is nothing," Terence stammered, his voice pitching up an octave. "It is just a spam text. You know how those automated debt collector scams are these days. They get your number and send these crazy threats. It means absolutely nothing, just a wrong number." Richard did not smile. He did not laugh. He stared at Terence, the silence stretching out over the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the hull of the boat. Jerome and Brenda exchanged nervous glances, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, but entirely unequipped to handle it. Lauren sat up on her sunbed looking confused. Before Terrence could offer another pathetic excuse, the heavy door leading to the bridge swung open. The boat captain, a tall, weathered man in a crisp white uniform, walked out onto the deck. He did not look at Richard Prescott. He did not look at Terrence or the wealthy guests lounging on the expensive furniture. He walked with brisk, purposeful strides directly past the billionaires and stopped right in front of me. The entire deck fell completely silent, watching the captain approach the disgraced hired help. "Excuse me, Ms. Vivian," the captain said, his voice carrying a tone of deep professional respect that echoed loudly in the quiet space. "Your private wealth manager is calling on the secured satellite phone on the bridge. He says it is a code red regarding your Vanguard Sterling accounts and insists he needs to speak with you immediately." My mother dropped her sunglasses onto the deck. Lauren let out a confused, breathless sound. Jerome stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. Terrence looked like he was about to pass out, sliding down in his seat as the reality of those words slammed into him. Why would the unemployed failure of the family, the domestic help serving sticky champagne, have a private wealth manager calling her on a secured satellite phone regarding a code red? I picked up my silver tray, looking down at my brother, who was currently drowning in the trap he had built for himself. "Tell him I will be right up, Captain," I said smoothly, offering the terrified table a beautiful, chilling smile. "Please excuse me. I have some actual business to attend to." I turned my back on their gaping mouths and followed the captain up the narrow teak stairs to the bridge, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in my wake. The secured satellite phone was resting on the navigation console, its green light blinking steadily in the dim cabin. I picked the heavy receiver up and pressed it to my ear. David was on the other end, his voice crisp and intensely professional, confirming that the offshore lender had officially filed federal fraud charges, and Terrence's shell corporation was now under active investigation. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated, forming a perfect sequence of destruction. I thanked David, instructed him to maintain the absolute freeze on all Vanguard Sterling assets, and ended the call. When I descended the stairs back to the main deck, the atmosphere had shifted from luxurious relaxation to absolute paralyzing paranoia. Lauren was aggressively scrolling through her phone, her jaw tight, while Diane Prescott whispered frantically to Richard. Terrence was pacing the stern, chewing on his thumbnail, his eyes wide with an animalistic panic. No one asked me about the call. They were too terrified of what the answer might be. The yacht ride back to the marina was agonizingly quiet, the expensive catered lunch sitting completely untouched on the silver platters as the tension choked the air out of the space. As soon as the massive boat docked, Terrence practically sprinted down the ramp, abandoning Lauren and the Prescotts without a single backward glance. He needed to find $10,000 to pay off a violent loan shark, and he was running out of time. I followed at a leisurely pace, carrying my empty silver tray, watching the carefully constructed facade of the wealthy Wilson family crack and splinter under the weight of impending reality. My mother, Brenda, was seething with a quiet, venomous rage. She had been humiliated in front of her wealthy friends, first by my supposed incompetence and then by the inexplicable respect the boat captain had shown me. She rode back to the main estate in the back of a luxury sedan in tight-lipped silence, her mind working furiously to rationalize what had just happened. I knew her well enough to know she could not let it go. She needed a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain. She needed to prove that I was still the useless daughter she had always claimed I was. So while I went into the main house kitchen to begin preparing the evening meal, she made her move. She marched across the perfectly manicured lawn, her heels sinking into the grass, and let herself into my pool house. Brenda tore through my small living space with the frantic, unhinged energy of a woman desperately looking for a justification for her hatred. She opened cabinets in the kitchenette, rifled through my modest closet, tossing simple dresses onto the floor, and overturned the cushions on the small sofa, looking for any sign of misbehavior, any dirt she could use to put me back in my place. She wanted to find unpaid bills or embarrassing secrets, something to prove that the satellite phone call was a prank or a mistake, something to reassert her dominance over my life. She yanked open the bottom drawer of my small wooden desk and found a thick manila folder tucked beneath a stack of blank baking invoices. She pulled it out, her hands trembling with righteous indignation, fully expecting to find proof of my pathetic failures. Instead, she opened the heavy cardstock folder and found a high gloss proof copy of next month's Forbes magazine. My face stared back at her from the cover. I was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, my arms crossed, looking powerful and completely untouchable. The bold white letters across the bottom of the page read, Vivian Wilson, the $50 million crisis fixer. How the elusive consultant saves failing empires. Brenda stared at the magazine cover, her mind violently rejecting the reality before her eyes. The daughter she had treated like a worthless servant, the woman she had publicly shamed and belittled for years, was a multimillionaire. She flipped through the glossy pages, reading the detailed spread about my aggressive corporate acquisitions, my ruthless efficiency in saving dying tech firms, and my massive personal net worth. The article detailed how I operated in the shadows, cleaning up the catastrophic messes made by incompetent executives, just like her precious son. Any normal mother would have felt a surge of overwhelming pride. She would have run to find me, weeping tears of joy, realizing her daughter was wildly successful and brilliant. But Brenda Wilson was not a normal mother. She did not feel pride. She felt utterly betrayed. She felt foolish. She rolled the magazine tightly in her fist, her knuckles turning white, her face twisting into a mask of pure, selfish fury. She felt that my success was a direct insult to her parenting and a threat to Terrence's golden status. I was standing at the massive kitchen island chopping vegetables when the heavy double doors swung open. Brenda marched toward me, her wedge heels slapping aggressively against the marble floor. She slammed the rolled-up magazine onto the granite countertop right next to my cutting board. It unrolled slightly, revealing my printed face and the $50 million headline. I set my knife down, wiping my hands on a cloth towel, maintaining my calm exterior, as I watched her chest heave with ragged, angry breaths. "You have been hiding money from us," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of shock and sheer rage. "You have $50 million, and you have been letting us treat you like a maid. How selfish are you, Vivian? Your brother is out there carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He is stressed out of his mind, trying to secure this family, a future, trying to take care of all of us, and you are sitting on a massive fortune, hoarding it all to yourself while he struggles. You let him beg you for $10,000 this morning. You sick, twisted girl. You could solve every single one of his problems with the stroke of a pen. But you would rather watch him suffer. You are the most disgusting, selfish person I have ever met." I listened to her unhinged rant, watching the way she twisted my massive success into a personal attack against her precious golden child. She was completely incapable of seeing his faults entirely, blind to the reality of who he really was. She wanted me to feel guilty for surviving, for thriving while he sank into the mud of his own creation. She genuinely believed my money belonged to him simply because he was the son, the one meant to carry the family legacy. I picked up the magazine and smoothed the glossy cover with my fingertips, my expression turning to absolute ice as I stared my mother down. "He is not taking care of this family." "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that echoed in the vast, quiet kitchen. "He is destroying it, and you handed him the matches." My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as her brain short-circuited, unable to process the absolute truth standing right in front of her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slap me across the face. But the cold, dead certainty in my eyes kept her frozen in place. I held her gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to be the timid, obedient daughter she had programmed me to be. I was the $50 million crisis fixer, and right now I was looking at the biggest crisis of her life. Before Brenda could find her voice to issue another toxic denial, the heavy brass knocker on the front double doors of the main estate began to echo through the expansive foyer. The sound was loud, authoritative, and completely out of place for a lazy Saturday afternoon. Brenda flinched, pulling her eyes away from me, and smoothed her linen shirt quickly, attempting to reassemble her shattered facade of suburban perfection. I simply crossed my arms, leaning back against the marble island, watching the final act of this tragedy unfold. Jerome marched out of the formal living room, adjusting his collar and puffing out his chest with the arrogant entitlement of a man who believed his wealth made him immune to the real world. "I will handle this," Jerome announced, his voice booming through the high-ceilinged hallway. "It is probably the local homeowners association complaining about the catering vans parked on the street again. You would think paying $10,000 a year in neighborhood fees would buy us a little peace and quiet." I followed Brenda out of the kitchen, standing in the arched doorway of the foyer, as Jerome threw open the massive wooden doors. Two uniformed police officers stood on the wide stone porch, their expressions stern and uncompromising, their hands resting near their heavy utility belts. They did not look like men who cared about catering vans or neighborhood noise ordinances. Jerome immediately adopted his condescending corporate tone, crossing his arms over his chest. "Look, officers, if this is about the vehicles parked along the curb, I have already spoken to the neighborhood security detail. We are hosting some important guests this afternoon, and the vans will be gone before sunset. There is absolutely no need to escalate a simple parking violation to the local police." The taller of the two officers, a man with graying temples and a face carved from stone, stepped forward completely, ignoring Jerome's pathetic display of authority. "We are not here about parking vehicles, sir," the officer said, his voice cutting through the thick, humid air. "We are looking for Terrence Wilson. Is he currently on the premises?" The color instantly drained from Jerome's face. His arrogant posture collapsed as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his thick skull. Brenda let out a small gasp, pressing her hand to her chest, taking a step backward toward the safety of the living room. Just then, Terrence and Lauren walked into the foyer from the back patio. Terrence looked like a walking corpse, his skin clammy and pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room, while Lauren clung to his arm, looking completely annoyed by the interruption. "What is going on here?" Lauren demanded, stepping in front of Terrence and glaring at the two officers with pure, unfiltered disdain. "Do you have any idea whose house this is? My husband is a highly successful executive, and we have Richard Prescott sitting on our back patio right now. You cannot just march up to our front door and harass us like common criminals. I want your badge numbers immediately. I'm calling the chief of police. He plays golf with my father." The younger officer pulled a thick, folded document from his jacket pocket, stepping past Lauren's ridiculous tantrum as if she were nothing more than a mild breeze. "Terrence Wilson?" the officer asked, locking eyes with my brother. Terrence swallowed hard, taking a step back and practically hiding behind his obnoxious wife. "I am Terrence," he squeaked, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his impending doom. "What is this about?" "We are here to serve a grand jury subpoena," the older officer stated loud enough for the entire house to hear. "You are required to appear in federal court this coming Tuesday regarding your offshore financial holdings and the recent transfer of Vanguard Sterling assets." Terrence began to hyperventilate, his eyes wild with terror. He looked at our parents, who were staring at him in absolute horror, and then his panicked gaze locked onto me, standing quietly in the kitchen doorway. The cowardice that had defined his entire life flared up in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save himself. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "It is her fault," Terrence yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria, throwing me under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "She handles all my mail. She is my assistant. She manages all my domestic paperwork and organizing. She must have messed something up. She probably filed the wrong tax forms or sent the documents to the wrong address. I do not know anything about this. It is just a clerical error, and it is entirely her fault. Arrest her. She is the one who ruined everything. Lauren immediately chimed in, nodding vigorously. Yes, exactly. His sister is completely incompetent. She has been jealous of his success for years and probably did this on purpose, just to embarrass us in front of my father. You need to investigate her, not my husband. I did not say a word. I did not even blink. I just stood there watching the ultimate manifestation of my brother's pathetic weakness. He was a drowning man trying to drag me down into the abyss with him, just as he had done his entire life. But this time, I was not in the water. I was standing safely on the shore, watching him sink. The older officer looked slowly from my calm face back to Terrence's panicked, sweating expression. The officer let out a low, humorless scoff, his lip curling in absolute disgust. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my brother, pushing the thick federal subpoena directly against Terrence's silk shirt. "We aren't here for paperwork, son," the officer said, his voice dropping to a lethal, gravelly pitch that completely silenced the room. "We are here for federal wire fraud." The older officer released his grip on the subpoena, letting the thick stack of heavy legal paper fall directly into Terrence's shaking hands. Terrence fumbled with the document, pulling it against his chest as if it were a shield. The two police officers did not say another word. They simply turned on their heavy black boots and walked out the massive front doors of the estate, their radios crackling in the quiet afternoon air. We all stood in the grand foyer listening to the sound of their police cruiser tires crunching against the expensive white gravel of the driveway, pulling away and leaving behind a suffocating blanket of absolute terror. Richard Prescott was the first to break the silence, and when he did, it was with the explosive violence of a man who was used to destroying lives with a single phone call. He closed the distance between himself and my brother in two long strides, grabbing Terrence by the collar of his expensive silk shirt and shoving him hard against the custom wood paneling of the hallway wall. Lauren let out a shrill scream, stumbling backward and covering her mouth with her hands. But Richard did not even look at his daughter. His face was inches from Terrence's, his skin flushed dark purple, with a rage so pure it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "Where is my money, you pathetic little con artist?" Richard bellowed, his voice shaking the crystal pieces of the chandelier hanging above us. "You stood in my office. You looked me in the eye and you promised me a secure offshore holding for $2 million of my capital. Where is my money?" "Terrence, if you tell me that federal subpoena means the government has frozen my assets, I will not just ruin your business. I will ruin your entire life. I will have my lawyers bury you so deep in litigation you will never see the sun again. Tell me where the money went right now." Terrence was trembling so violently I could hear the thick paper of the subpoena crinkling against his chest. He looked at Richard, his eyes wide and panicked like a trapped rabbit, and then he looked at Jerome and Brenda, who were standing frozen in shock, unable to comprehend that their perfect son was being physically threatened in their own home. Terrence opened his mouth, but only a pathetic squeak came out. He needed a way out. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to take the fall for his massive, catastrophic failures. And as his desperate eyes darted around the grand foyer, they finally landed on me, standing calmly in the doorway. "It is her!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He pushed Richard away just enough to step to the side, using his sudden burst of adrenaline to spin the most insane web of lies I had ever heard in my entire life. "It was Vivian. She did this. She is the one who stole your money, Richard. I swear to God I am innocent. She handles all my domestic paperwork. She has access to my home network. She hacked into my secure servers and set up those shell corporations using my identity to frame me." I watched him piece the delusion together in real time, and the sheer audacity of it was almost impressive, if it had not been so pathetic. He was actually trying to convince a billionaire tech investor that his unemployed sister had masterminded an international wire fraud scheme. "She is a bitter, jealous psycho," Terrence yelled, pacing back and forth, waving the subpoena in the air. "She has spent the last 5 years living in our pool house, doing nothing but plotting to destroy me. Because she could not stand my success. She manipulated the accounts she forged, the offshore deeds. She even engineered that banking glitch this morning to make me look bad in front of you. She is a criminal hacker, and she stole your $2 million. You have to believe me. I am carrying the legacy of this family, and she is trying to tear it all down out of pure spite." Any rational human being would have laughed in his face. Richard Prescott certainly looked skeptical, narrowing his eyes at Terence as if evaluating the mental stability of the man who was supposed to marry his daughter. But Jerome and Brenda Wilson were not rational human beings. They were parents who had built their entire identities around the illusion of their sons. Perfection. They needed him to be the golden child because his success was their success, and faced with the undeniable proof of a federal subpoena, they chose blind, desperate delusion. They chose to believe the impossible lie because the truth was too devastating to endure. Jerome stepped forward, his chest puffing out again, his fear instantly evaporating. Now that he had a target he could actually bully. He glared at me with an expression of pure revulsion, as if I were a disease that had infected his perfect home. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Jerome demanded, his voice trembling with righteous anger. "After everything we have given you, after we let you live on our property for free, you try to send your brother to federal prison. You are a monster, Vivian, a sociopathic monster." Brenda did not just yell. She marched across the foyer, her wedge heels clicking sharply against the marble floor until she was standing inches from my face. I could smell the expensive white wine on her breath and see the frantic, crazed energy in her eyes. She raised her hand as if she wanted to strike me, but stopped herself, pointing a finger so close to my nose I could feel the air moving. "You jealous, spiteful girl!" Brenda screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You framed your own brother because you could not stand his success. You sat in that pool house letting us feed you and house you while you plotted to ruin the only good thing that has ever happened to this family. You stole Mr. Prescott's money to destroy Terrence's reputation. I am calling those police officers back right now, and I am going to watch them put you in handcuffs. You are going to rot in a federal cell for what you have done." Lauren stepped up beside her mother-in-law, nodding vigorously, her designer sunglasses clutched in her hand. "Yes," she agreed, looking at me with absolute disgust. She always looked at Terrence with such envy. I knew there was something wrong with her. She probably hid the money in one of those offshore accounts. She is trying to ruin my wedding. I stood perfectly still, letting their hatred wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not try to explain the logistical impossibility of an unemployed baker orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. I just looked at the three of them, my parents and my brother, seeing them for exactly what they were, weak, greedy parasites who would rather cannibalize their own daughter than face the reality of their failures. The last remaining shred of familial obligation I held in my heart evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, diamond-hard resolve. I turned away from my screaming mother and walked slowly, deliberately out of the foyer and into the massive, formal living room. The room was a monument to their fake wealth, featuring high vaulted ceilings, custom leather furniture, and an 85-inch flat-screen television mounted proudly above the marble fireplace. I could hear them following me, their angry footsteps echoing as Jerome continued to shout threats about lawyers and prison time. I walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up the sleek black remote control. I pressed a single button, and the massive television screen flashed to life, the input switching automatically to the secure encrypted server I had set up from the pool house. The screen glowed a bright, stark white, illuminating the entire living room and casting long shadows against the walls. I turned around the remote, resting easily in my hand, and faced the terrified, panicking people who used to be my family. I looked at Terrence, who was sweating through his silk shirt. I looked at Brenda, who was still clutching her chest. I looked at Richard Prescott, who was staring at the blank screen with sudden calculating interest. "Sit down, all of you," I said, my voice dropping the subservient tone I had used for years, replacing it with the cold, absolute authority of the $50 million crisis fixer. I did not yell, but the command echoed off the high ceilings, cutting through their chaotic noise like a blade. "It is time for a presentation." Brenda stood perfectly still, her manicured hands trembling against the cool granite countertop as my words hung heavily in the air between us. The absolute certainty in my voice completely derailed whatever toxic rant she had prepared next. She looked down at the Forbes magazine cover and then back up at me, her brain desperately trying to bridge the gap between the subservient daughter she had always bullied and the ruthless crisis fixer staring back at her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could formulate a single syllable, the deep, heavy sound of the brass front door knocker echoed through the cavernous hallways of the main estate. The knocking was loud, rhythmic, and distinctly aggressive, carrying a weight of authority that instantly commanded attention. Brenda flinched, stepping away from the kitchen island, as Jerome marched past the arched doorway, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished marble floors. He was aggressively pulling at the collar of his nautical-themed polo shirt, puffing his chest out with the exaggerated indignation of a wealthy man who believed his zip code made him immune to everyday inconveniences. "I will handle this," Jerome announced, his voice booming through the foyer, dripping with privileged annoyance. "It is probably just the neighborhood security detail complaining about the catering vans parked on the curb again. You would think paying $10,000 a year in association fees would buy us a little peace and quiet, instead of this constant harassment over minor parking violations. I am going to have a serious talk with the board about the incompetent staff they keep hiring to patrol our streets." I wiped my hands on a cloth towel, leaving the magazine on the counter, and followed Brenda out of the kitchen, standing quietly in the shadows of the arched doorway to watch the scene unfold. Jerome threw open the massive wooden double doors with an angry flourish, ready to unleash a torrent of arrogant abuse upon whoever had dared to interrupt his luxurious Saturday afternoon. But the people standing on the wide stone porch were not neighborhood security guards in cheap polo shirts. Two uniformed police officers stood perfectly still in the harsh afternoon sunlight, their expressions stern and utterly uncompromising, their hands resting loosely near their heavy utility belts. They did not look like men who cared about catering vans or neighborhood noise ordinances. They looked like men who had come to do a job. The squad car was parked halfway up the circular driveway, its lights off but its presence casting a long, intimidating shadow over the pristine property. Jerome instantly shifted his posture, recognizing the genuine authority standing on his doorstep, but his arrogance remained firmly intact. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, looking down his nose at the two officers. "Look, officers, if this is about the vehicles parked along the curb, I have already spoken to the neighborhood association we are hosting. Some extremely important guests this afternoon, and the vans will be gone before sunset. There is absolutely no need to escalate a simple parking violation to the local police department. We are law-abiding citizens here, and this is highly unnecessary." The taller of the two officers, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and a face carved from stone, stepped forward completely, ignoring Jerome's pathetic display of wealthy entitlement. His dark eyes swept past Jerome, scanning the interior of the grand foyer. "We are not here about parking vehicles, sir," the officer said, his voice cutting through the thick, humid air like a serrated blade. "We are looking for a Terrence Wilson. Is he currently on the premises?" The color instantly drained from Jerome's face, his arrogant posture collapsing as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his thick skull. Brenda let out a small, sharp gasp, pressing her trembling hand to her chest, taking a step backward toward the safety of the formal living room. Just then, Terrence and Lauren walked into the foyer from the back patio. Terrence looked like a walking corpse, his skin clammy and deathly pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room while Lauren clung tightly to his arm. Looking completely annoyed by the interruption, she clearly had not registered the uniforms standing at her front door. "What is going on here?" Lauren demanded, stepping in front of Terrence and glaring at the two officers with pure, unfiltered disdain, playing the ultimate Karen card, without a single second of hesitation. "Do you have any idea whose house this is? My husband is a highly successful executive, and we have Richard Prescott sitting on our back patio right now. You cannot just march up to our front door and harass us like common criminals. I want your badge numbers immediately. I am calling the chief of police. He plays golf with my father, and I will have both of your jobs by morning. You have no right to barge in here and ruin our afternoon. The younger officer pulled a thick folded document from his dark jacket pocket, stepping past Lauren's ridiculous tantrum as if she were nothing more than a mild breeze. He did not even acknowledge her threats. Terrence Wilson, the officer asked, locking his cold professional eyes directly onto my brother. Terrence swallowed hard, taking a stumbling step back and practically hiding behind his obnoxious wife. He looked like a terrified child trapped in a corner, his bravado entirely stripped away, leaving only the trembling shell of a desperate fraud. "I am Terrence," he squeaked, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his impending doom. "What is this about? I have not done anything wrong. We are here to serve a grand jury subpoena," the older officer stated loud enough for the entire house to hear. "You are required to appear in federal court this coming Tuesday regarding your offshore financial holdings and the recent transfer of Vanguard sterling assets. You need to sign this acknowledgement of receipt." Terrence began to hyperventilate, his eyes wide and wild with absolute animalistic terror. He looked at our parents, who were staring at him in paralyzing horror, unable to process that their golden child was being served federal papers in their own foyer. And then his panicked, desperate gaze locked onto me, standing quietly in the kitchen doorway. The cowardice that had defined his entire pathetic life flared up in a frantic attempt to save his own skin. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to take the fall for his massive, catastrophic failures. And as always, he chose the path of least resistance. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at my face. "It is her fault." Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, throwing me under the bus without a single ounce of shame. His breathing was erratic, his face slick with panic. "She handles all my mail. She is my assistant. She manages all my domestic paperwork and organizing. She must have messed something up. She probably filed the wrong tax forms or sent the sensitive documents to the wrong address. I do not know anything about this. I am a busy man. I have important things to do. It is just a clerical error, and it is entirely her fault. Arrest her. She is the one who ruins everything. She is trying to destroy me." Lauren immediately chimed in, nodding vigorously, pointing her manicured finger at me, backing up her husband's absurd lies. "Yes, exactly," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "His sister is completely incompetent. She has been jealous of his success for years and probably did this on purpose just to embarrass us in front of my father. You need to investigate her." "Not my husband. He is innocent. She is just a bitter maid who lives in our pool house." I did not say a word. I did not even blink. I just stood there, perfectly calm, watching the ultimate manifestation of my brother's pathetic weakness. He was a drowning man, trying to drag me down into the abyss with him, just as he had done his entire life. But this time, I was not in the water. I was standing safely on the shore, watching him sink into the mud of his own creation. The contrast between his frantic screaming and my absolute silence spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. The older officer looked slowly from my calm, composed face back to Terrence's panicked, sweating expression. The officer let out a low, humorless scoff, his lip curling in absolute pure disgust. He saw right through the pathetic facade. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my brother, pushing the thick federal subpoena directly against Terrence's expensive silk shirt, forcing him to take it. I pressed the right arrow on the sleek black remote, and the giant screen shifted from a glaring white to a stark, minimalist title slide. The high-definition display cast a cold, bluish glow across the expensive leather furniture and the horrified faces of my audience. Richard Prescott remained standing near the arched doorway, his sharp, predatory eyes narrowing as he analyzed the shifting power dynamic in the room. Jerome and Brenda had frozen in place, their mouths slightly open, their previous rage momentarily suspended by sheer confusion. Lauren let go of Terrence's arm, crossing her arms over her chest defensively, while Terrence simply stared at the screen as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. The words on the screen were simple, but they carried the weight of an absolute death sentence. Bold black letters against a crisp white background. spelling out the fall of the golden child. What is the meaning of this? Jerome demanded, his voice losing some of its booming authority and replacing it with a nervous tremor. He looked from the screen to me and back again, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers. Turn that television off. Right now, Vivian. We are in the middle of a serious legal crisis, and you are playing some kind of sick, twisted, childish game. You have always been jealous of your brother, but this is crossing a line even for you. I ignored him entirely, letting the silence stretch for another agonizing 5 seconds before I clicked the button again. The slide transitioned seamlessly, revealing a high-resolution scan of a highly sensitive legal document. The text was small, but the bold headers were impossible to miss. It was the official property deed for the sprawling $8 million estate we were currently standing in. I watched my father's eyes scan the massive screen reading the heavily redacted document, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of why I was showing them the deed to what he believed was his son's house. You told everyone. Terrence bought this estate. Dad, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated, echoing softly in the cavernous living room. You stood at the country club, you sat at charity galas, and you proudly bragged to anyone who would listen that your brilliant son had purchased this architectural masterpiece. You told the world that he was a real estate genius, that his corporate success was so massive he could afford to drop $8 million on a whim. You paraded around these halls, acting like the lord of the manor, drinking expensive scotch, and looking down on the very people who actually worked for a living. All because you thought Terrence was the king of the world. Terrence let out a pathetic whimpering sound, taking a step backward until his calves hit the edge of a heavy leather armchair. He knew exactly what was coming. He had known for months that his lies were building a house of cards, but he had been too arrogant and too cowardly to admit it. He tried to open his mouth to interrupt me, to spin another desperate web of deceit, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just stood there, sweating profusely, his expensive silk shirt clinging to his trembling body, looking like a man watching the executioner sharpen the blade. Lauren looked at him, her face twisting in confusion, her tiny mind struggling to comprehend why her highly successful husband was cowering in front of a giant television screen instead of yelling at me to get out of his house. I clicked the remote one more time, zooming in on the bottom section of the property deed, highlighting the official ownership registry. The name on the document was not Terrence Wilson, it was not Jerome Wilson, and it certainly was not Lauren. It was printed in undeniable stark black ink, Apex Holdings, LLC. Jerome squinted at the screen, reading the corporate name out loud, his voice dropping to a confused whisper. What does that mean? He asked, looking at Terrence, who was now visibly shaking. What is Apex Holdings, Terrence? I thought you put this house in a private family trust. Like you told me you did. You said it was for tax purposes to protect your vast assets from federal oversight. He lied to you, I said calmly, walking slowly around the edge of the glass coffee table, my eyes locked onto my father's bewildered face. He never bought this house. He never had the money to buy this house. He was completely broke, living off fraudulent loans and empty promises when you all decided to move in here. But Apex Holdings is my company. Dad, I bought this $8 million estate in straight cash. I own the walls you are standing between. I own the roof over your head. I own the very floor you are standing on. I let you stay here. I let you parade around claiming my success as his, just to see how far you would actually go to protect your precious golden son. I let you treat me like a maid in my own home, to see if there was a single shred of decency left in any of you. There was not. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Brenda let out a strangled, dramatic gasp, her eyes rolling back into her head as she performed a perfectly timed theatrical swoon. She stumbled backward, grabbing onto the edge of a marble side table to stop herself from collapsing completely to the floor, fanning her face with her free hand. "Oh my God," she wailed softly. shaking her head back and forth as if trying to physically reject the words I had just spoken. Jerome stood absolutely paralyzed, his jaw physically dropping open, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The foundation of his entire reality. His unwavering belief in Terrence's superiority and my total worthlessness was disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to the ground, unable to comprehend how the daughter he had always treated with such casual cruelty was actually the master of his fate. Lauren stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She looked from the screen to me, her face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and pure unfiltered denial. "But that is impossible." Lauren stamped, her voice shrill and grating as she pointed an accusing finger at me. "You are unemployed. You sit in that pool house all day doing nothing. You do not have a real job. You do not have any money. Terrence pays for everything. He pays for your groceries. He pays for your life. How could you possibly own an $8 million house? You are just making this up. You forged that document to make him look bad because you are jealous of what we have together. You could never achieve what my husband has achieved." I smiled at her, a slow, chilling smirk that made her take a sudden, nervous step back. I looked past her to where Richard Prescott was standing watching me with a newly minted expression of absolute respect and dawning realization. He knew exactly what Apex Holdings was. He knew the kind of ruthless efficiency associated with that name. He knew that the woman serving him sticky champagne just an hour ago was actually the apex predator in the room. I turned my attention back to my terrified sister-in-law, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm in her expensive designer dress. "I own a crisis management firm, Lauren," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I fix massive, catastrophic messes for billionaires. And right now, I am looking at the biggest mess of my entire career." I pressed the right arrow on the remote again, and the massive screen behind me transitioned with a sickeningly cheerful corporate chime, replacing the property deed with a complex, brightly colored flowchart. It was a beautiful web of deceit, mapping out routing numbers, wire transfers, shell companies, and offshore accounts highlighted in glaring neon red. I looked directly at Richard Prescott, who was currently staring at the screen with the terrifying stillness of an apex predator about to strike. "Mr. Prescott, your $2 million did not go into a revolutionary tech merger," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the vast, silent living room. "It never even touched a legitimate investment portfolio. Instead, it was routed through 3 different dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands before being quietly filtered right back here into domestic accounts controlled by the very people standing in this room." I clicked the remote, and a section of the flowchart magnified, filling the left side of the screen with a series of bank statements and highly incriminating purchase receipts. I pointed a single finger at my sister-in-law, who was currently clutching her chest, as if she could physically hold her heart inside her ribcage. $500,000 of your initial investment capital went directly into a private account managed by Terrence. I continued watching as Lauren's eyes widened in absolute horror. That exact sum was immediately used to secure the lease on Lauren's pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon and to purchase the 5-carat Cartier diamond ring currently sitting on her left hand. Terrence did not buy that ring with his hard-earned corporate success. Lauren, your father bought it for you without even knowing it. Your entire luxurious lifestyle, your image as the wealthy elite wife of a self-made genius. It is all funded by the money your husband stole from your own father." Richard slowly turned his head to look at his daughter, his face flushing a dark, dangerous shade of beet red, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He did not say a word to her, but the look of absolute violent betrayal in his eyes was enough to make Lauren physically recoil. She looked down at her left hand, staring at the massive sparkling diamond as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous spider. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged gasps of air, her chest heaving as the carefully constructed illusion of her perfect life shattered into a million jagged pieces, her entire identity, the smug, wealthy superiority she used to look down on me and everyone else, was entirely built on a foundation of theft and fraud. But that is just a fraction of the missing capital, I said, turning my attention back to the screen and clicking the remote. One more time, the display shifted again, bringing a new set of financial records front and center, displaying massive bold red numbers that indicated severe long-term debt. Let us talk about the remaining $1.5 million, the money that was supposed to secure the future of the Wilson family legacy. I shifted my gaze to my parents. Jerome and Brenda were standing frozen near the sofa, their faces drained of all color, looking like two people standing on the gallows, waiting for the trapdoor to open. I had spent my entire life listening to them preach about financial responsibility and the virtues of hard work, while they actively shamed me for my supposed failures. Now it was their turn to stand in the harsh, glaring light of the truth. The remaining $1.5 million did not go into Terrence's failing business. I announced, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. It went directly to paying off the massive secret gambling debts that Jerome and Brenda have been hiding for the last 7 years. It went to settling the suffocating federal tax liens the IRS had placed on your previous properties because you two were too busy trying to look like billionaires to actually pay your taxes. Terrence did not save this family. He bought your blind loyalty. He used stolen money to cover up your pathetic addictions and your financial incompetence, so you would continue to worship him as the golden child and treat me like dirt. The silence in the living room was absolute and suffocating. Brenda covered her face with her hands, letting out a low, guttural sob of pure humiliation. Her secret, the ugly truth she had hidden behind expensive country club memberships and designer clothes, was now broadcast in high definition for a prominent billionaire to see. Jerome looked physically sick, his jaw working silently as he stared at the screen, unable to deny the meticulously documented proof of his own pathetic failures. They had sold their souls and their daughter for the illusion of wealth. Terrence could not take it anymore. His entire reality was imploding. His lies were exposed, his fraudulent empire was dismantled, and the people he had manipulated were turning against him. He let out a primal, agonizing scream, a sound of pure, unhinged desperation that tore from his throat like a wounded animal. He completely snapped, losing the final shred of his sanity as he lunged forward. He threw himself across the living room, charging directly at me, with his hands raised like claws, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his teeth bared in a feral grimace. He wanted to smash the television. He wanted to physically silence me. He wanted to destroy the person who was tearing down his perfect golden life. "I will kill you," he screamed, his voice cracking with violent hysteria. "You ruined everything. I am going to kill you." I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I just stood there watching him charge, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. Before Terrence could even reach the edge of the glass coffee table, before his manicured hands could come anywhere near me, the heavy swinging doors leading to the kitchen burst open. Two massive men stepped out of the shadows, moving with terrifying lethal speed. They were dressed in tactical black suits, earpieces curled tightly around their ears, their faces blank masks of absolute professional violence. They were the elite private security detail I employed to protect my assets and my life. The first guard hit Terrence like a freight train, tackling him around the waist and lifting his feet entirely off the hardwood floor. Terrence let out a strangled gasp as the air was violently forced from his lungs. The second guard grabbed Terrence, flailing arms, twisting them expertly behind his back. As they slammed my brother face first into the polished wood, the impact echoed through the room with a sickening thud, shaking the crystal glasses on the side tables. Terrence thrashed and kicked, screaming incoherently as the two massive security guards pinned him effortlessly to the floor, pressing their knees into his spine and holding his wrists in a brutal locking grip. His face was mashed against the expensive rug, his perfect hair wildly disheveled, his silk shirt torn as he sobbed in helpless, pathetic defeat. I looked down at my brother, the golden child, the undisputed king of the Wilson family, now pinned to the floor, like a common criminal, whimpering and crying, while the entire room watched in stunned, horrified silence. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the fabric of my simple clothes, and offered the room a cold, beautiful smile. Jerome stared at his son pinned to the floor, the illusion of his perfect family completely shattered into a million irreversible pieces. But instead of reflecting on the monstrous fraud his golden boy had committed, his toxic patriarchal instincts flared to life, blinding him to the reality of the situation. He could not accept that the daughter he had treated like absolute garbage for decades was the one holding all the power. He stepped over the shattered pieces of his own dignity and marched toward me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement, demanding that the world bend to his will one last time. "Call off your thugs right now, Vivian!" Jerome bellowed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and pure enraged arrogance. "You are going to fix this mess immediately. I am your father, and I demand that you transfer the deed to this house over to Terrence. This very second we can sell this estate. We can liquidate the assets, and we can use the capital to pay back Mr. Prescott and make all these federal charges go away. You owe this family, you owe your brother, and if you do not sign that property over to him right now, you are dead to us, Vivian. You will never be part of this family again." The absolute sheer audacity of his demand was almost poetic in its delusion. Here he was standing in the middle of an $8 million home that I owned, surrounded by the devastating wreckage of his son's massive federal wire fraud, and his only solution was to try and bully me into sacrificing my own hard-earned wealth to save a criminal. The man had lived his entire life believing his loud voice and aggressive posture could rewrite reality. But reality had finally caught up to him, and it was wearing my face. I looked at him, my expression completely devoid of the desperate longing for approval that used to govern my every interaction with him. The threat of being dead to them was not a punishment. It was the exact prize I had been waiting to claim. "I am already dead to you, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air of the living room with the cold precision of a scalpel. "I died to you the day you decided my only value was being a subservient punching bag for your golden child. But since you are so suddenly concerned with legal documents and property transfers, I think it is time we revisit the paperwork you signed the day you moved your massive egos into my estate." I reached into the sleek black leather portfolio resting on the glass coffee table and pulled out a crisp, thick stack of stapled papers, holding it up for him to see. "Do you remember this document, Jerome?" I asked, using his first name to entirely strip away his remaining paternal authority. "You thought you were signing a standard neighborhood liability waiver for the homeowners association. You were so arrogant, so eager to assume your position as the lord of the manor, that you did not even bother to read the fine print. Before you scrawled your arrogant signature across the bottom line, you just wanted the keys to the castle so badly, you blinded yourself to the fact that you were signing a legally binding contract." I flipped to the second page, holding it steady so he could see his own aggressive handwriting staring back at him. "This is not a liability waiver, Jerome. This is a standard month-to-month lease agreement, legally binding you as a tenant of Apex Holdings, LLC. Jerome's face drained of whatever color had managed to return to it, his mouth opening and closing as his eyes darted frantically over the legal text he had blindly signed away. His rights, assuming his daughter was too stupid and too submissive to ever outsmart him. I watched the devastating realization wash over him as I flipped to the fourth page, pointing directly to a specific, heavily bolded paragraph near the center of the document. "But the best part is Clause 4. I continued, my tone, conversational, but laced with absolute lethal finality. "Clause 4 explicitly states that any illegal or criminal activity conducted on the premises by the tenant or their extended guests results in an immediate eviction and a non-negotiable $50,000 penalty fee." You did not just break the lease, Jerome. You invited a federal criminal to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar international wire fraud scheme from my guest house. You used my internet servers to steal from a billionaire investor while sleeping under my roof. So not only are you not getting a single square inch of this property, but you are officially evicted as of this exact second. And you currently owe my crisis management firm $50,000 for breach of contract. You have absolutely nothing left. You have no money, you have no house. And your precious golden child is going to federal prison. Brenda let out another wretched wailing sob sliding down the side of the wall until she was sitting in a pathetic heap on the floor, ruining her expensive designer dress as she wept for the total destruction of her fake high society life. She was clawing at the expensive carpet, realizing that the country club lunches, the spa days, the arrogant bragging to her social circle, it was all gone forever, replaced by crushing debt and inescapable public humiliation. Lauren was hyperventilating so violently she had to lean against the marble fireplace, her hands pulling at her hair as she finally realized that the white savior facade she had built around her marriage was entirely funded by her own father's. Stolen money. She looked down at the glittering Cartier ring on her finger and let out a sound of pure revulsion, realizing she was wearing the physical proof of her husband's. Criminal deceit. She was not a wealthy, elite wife. She was just a broke accomplice to a massive criminal conspiracy. Terrence was still pinned firmly to the floor by my security team, his expensive silk shirt stained with his own tears, completely broken and entirely defeated. He was weakly thrashing against the unyielding weight of the guards, his sob echoing off the custom wood paneling. The undisputed king of the Wilson family reduced to a trembling puddle of regret. Richard Prescott stood silently watching the entire flawless execution of my trap, with the calculating admiration of a man who recognized true power when he saw it. He did not interrupt, he did not demand his money back. In that moment, he just watched the magnificent collapse of the Wilson family, knowing that the woman standing in the center of the room, holding the remote control and the lease agreement, was someone he would gladly hire to destroy his own corporate enemies. The $50 million crisis fixer had just delivered a masterclass in absolute unmitigated retribution. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the pathetic sniffling of my mother and the ragged, gasping breaths of my brother. But then another sound began to bleed into the cavernous living room, starting as a faint, distant wail and growing rapidly louder, piercing through the thick, heavy glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a sound that made Terrence completely freeze under the crushing weight of the security guard's boots, the shrill, screaming wail of real actual sirens multiplying and echoing down the private gated streets of the neighborhood. The high-pitched mechanical screaming of the approaching vehicles cut through the last remaining shreds of denial in the room. The flashing red and blue lights began to bounce off the towering oak trees lining the property, casting frantic, strobing shadows through the sheer curtains of the living room windows. I looked out the massive front glass, watching the reflection of the relentless flashing lights paint the pristine white gravel of my driveway, as a fleet of dark, heavily armored federal vehicles violently pulled up to the main estate gates. The heavy custom oak front doors did not just open, they were practically blown off their reinforced hinges as a massive tidal wave of dark tactical gear and federal windbreakers flooded into my pristine grand foyer. The sheer physical force of the FBI raid completely shattered the suffocating silence of the formal living room, replacing it with the sharp barking commands of armed agents spreading out rapidly across the expensive imported marble floors. Their heavy combat boots tracking dirt and harsh, unforgiving reality, all over my mother's carefully curated illusion of high society wealth. They poured into the formal spaces of the estate, moving with terrifying military precision, bypassing the expensive crystal vases and the custom leather furniture, as if it were all just cheap plastic props on a discarded movie set. Jerome stumbled backward, his face draining of all blood, backing into the glass coffee table and nearly knocking over the leather portfolio containing his own eviction notice. His arms raised in a pathetic defensive gesture as the flashing red and blue lights from the driveway strobed violently across his terrified face. My private security detail stepped back seamlessly, melting into the shadows of the kitchen hallway as the federal agents swarmed the spot where Terrence was still trembling on the expensive Persian rug, they hauled him to his feet with zero hesitation and zero respect for his expensive silk shirt or his perfectly manicured image pulling his arms roughly behind his back. The metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoing off the high vaulted ceilings as they locked tightly around his wrists. The golden child, the untouchable genius of the Wilson family, was sobbing openly. Now his face smeared with tears and dust, a long, pathetic string of drool hanging from his chin, as a tall agent in a dark blue windbreaker loudly read him his Miranda rights, listing off a devastating series of federal wire fraud and international embezzlement charges that carried decades of mandatory prison time. Terrence kept twisting his head around, looking wildly at Jerome and Brenda, crying out for them to do something, to call a lawyer, to use their influence to make the bad men stop. But his parents were entirely paralyzed, stripped of all their fake authority, and reduced to horrified mute spectators, watching their entire legacy evaporate into thin air. Richard Prescott did not miss a single beat. He did not look shocked. He did not look panicked. He simply pulled a sleek smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket and stepped away from the chaotic center of the room, turning his back entirely on my screaming brother. The billionaire tech investor placed a call to his armada of corporate lawyers, speaking in a low, rapid-fire tone, already initiating the aggressive legal firewalls required to completely sever his company and his personal wealth from the radioactive fallout of Terrence's criminal empire. Richard watched the FBI agents physically pat down his soon-to-be former son-in-law with the cold, detached clinical interest of a man watching a defective piece of machinery being tossed into an industrial incinerator. He was already running the numbers, calculating the exact public relations spin needed to paint himself as an innocent victim of a sociopathic con artist, completely erasing Terrence from his life without a single second thought. Lauren finally snapped out of her hyperventilating stupor as she watched the federal agents begin to drag her thrashing husband toward the arched doorway. The absolute reality of her situation hit her with the explosive force of a runaway freight train. She was not going to be the elite wife of a tech billionaire. She was not going to be hosting charity galas or flying private to the Cayman Islands. She was going to be the disgraced, humiliated wife of a convicted federal felon. She let out a piercing, completely unhinged shriek of pure rage and lunged forward, not to save Terrence, but to absolutely destroy him. She grabbed his arm, spinning him around as the agents momentarily paused. "You lied to me," she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "You told me you were a genius. You told me we were rich. You are nothing but a pathetic, disgusting fraud." Lauren reached down and grabbed the massive 5-carat Cartier diamond ring that Terrence had bought her with her own father's stolen money, pulling it violently off her finger, scraping her knuckle in her desperate frenzy. To detach herself from his sinking ship, she threw the heavy platinum ring directly at his face, the diamond striking his cheekbone before bouncing off and rolling uselessly under a nearby velvet armchair. "I am filing for an annulment tomorrow, you sociopathic loser," she sobbed furiously, backing away and practically running toward her father, who did not even bother to look up from his phone call. Terrence was hauled away, his pathetic wailing fading down the grand hallway until the heavy front doors slammed shut behind him, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the crackling radios of the agents remaining to secure the property. Jerome collapsed onto the leather sofa, staring blankly at the wall, his mind completely shattered by the absolute destruction of his fragile ego. But Brenda was a survivor of a very different breed. She realized with horrifying clarity that her golden son was gone. Her wealthy daughter-in-law had defected. Her husband was powerless, and her massive secret debts were still hanging over her head. Her frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the wreckage of the living room until they locked onto me. Standing completely composed by the fireplace, the unemployed poolhouse baker who somehow owned an $8 million estate and ran a crisis management firm for billionaires. Brenda did not just walk toward me. She literally threw herself across the room, falling heavily onto her bruised knees right at my feet. her expensive designer dress tearing at the seam as she scrambled forward, reaching out with trembling manicured hands and grabbing desperately onto my legs. She looked up at me, her face a smeared, terrifying mask of running mascara and desperate tears clutching the fabric of my trousers as if I were a life raft in a raging hurricane. "Vivian, please!" she begged, her voice a high-pitched, agonizing whine of total submission. "Please, you have to save him. You have these billionaire clients. You have connections. You clearly have money. You have to call someone and make this go away. He is your brother Vivian. He is your flesh and blood. Please do not let them take my boy away. I will do anything you want. We will do whatever you say. Just use your firm to fix this. Please, Vivian, please save our family." I looked down at the woman who had spent 30 years tearing me down, making me feel small, worthless, and invisible, the woman who had happily thrown me to the wolves just 10 minutes ago when she thought Terrence could still be saved. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, diamond-hard resolve. I reached down and gently but firmly pried her shaking hands off my legs, stepping back so she fell forward onto the carpet. "You told me if I did not like it here, I could find somewhere else," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper that froze the very blood in her veins. "I highly suggest you take your own advice. You have 10 minutes to vacate my property." Brenda stared at me as if I had just spoken to her in a foreign language, her mind completely unable to process the fact that she was being thrown out into the freezing night air without a single cent to her name. The 10-minute countdown had officially started, and the elite private security team I employed did not care about her fake country club status or her designer wardrobe. Two of my guards stepped forward, their expressions blank and unyielding, grabbing Jerome by his upper arms and hauling him to his feet, while a female security operative hauled Brenda up by her elbows. "You heard? Ms. Vivian." The lead guard barked, his voice echoing through the chaos. 10 minutes to pack, whatever you can carry. Any item purchased with stolen funds remains on the premises. Move." The local police had already arrived to secure the outer perimeter, forming a solid barricade of flashing blue lights, while the FBI agents continued dismantling Terrence's fraudulent empire in the guest house, dragging out boxes of hard drives and financial ledgers. The sheer scale of the raid was unprecedented for this quiet, exclusive Martha's Vineyard neighborhood. Jerome and Brenda were practically shoved up the grand curved staircase, their legs trembling so violently they could barely manage the carpeted steps. My guards followed closely behind them, standing inside the massive walk-in closets with their arms crossed, watching like hawks, as my parents desperately scrambled to shove whatever they could into a pair of basic canvas suitcases. Brenda was hyperventilating, grabbing handfuls of silk blouses and cashmere sweaters, trying to stuff them into her bags. But her hands were shaking too badly. She was crying hysterically, begging the guards for more time, pleading for just one more hour to sort through her diamond jewelry. But the female operative just tapped her tactical watch and told her she had exactly 6 minutes left. The ultimate humiliation. For a woman who had spent her entire existence obsessing over appearances was now unfolding in high definition. Real time, forced to pack her entire life away under the silent judging eyes of armed strangers, treated exactly like the criminal squatter she truly was. Downstairs, the front doors remained wide open, letting in the harsh, freezing ocean wind and the relentless red and blue strobe lights. Lauren had already fled the living room, making a frantic, tearful phone call to her own divorce attorneys, completely abandoning the Wilson sinking ship the moment she realized there was no money left outside in the massive circular driveway. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was backing up with a loud mechanical grinding noise. The FBI had already run the asset tags on Lauren's pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon, confirming it was purchased directly using the stolen Cayman Island funds. I watched from the front porch as thick, heavy steel chains were wrapped around the axles of the luxury SUV, dragging it violently up onto the flatbed with a screeching metallic scrape that echoed through the trees. Jerome and Brenda finally stumbled down the grand staircase, carrying one hastily packed suitcase, each their faces pale and gaunt, stripped of all their arrogant superiority. They walked out the front doors, stepping into the glaring spotlights of the police cruisers. The massive spectacle had drawn out the entire neighborhood. The extremely wealthy elite residents of Martha's Vineyard, the CEOs, the senators, the generational wealth that Brenda had so desperately tried to impress, were all standing at the edges of their manicured lawns, wrapped in expensive robes, whispering and pointing as my parents were escorted out, like common thieves. Brenda tried to hide her face behind her hands, sobbing openly, as she felt the burning, judgmental stares of the exact society women she had bragged to just hours earlier. She was ruined, completely and utterly ruined. There was no coming back from a federal raid and a public eviction. Jerome looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man, his shoulders slumped, his chest caved in, staring blankly at the empty spot on the gravel where the G-Wagon used to be parked. They had no cars, no money, and no options. One of the local police officers informed them they could not remain on the premises, and since their primary vehicle was officially impounded, they had to call a local island taxi, a beat-up yellow cab with rust along the wheel wells, and a sputtering engine finally rattled up the long driveway, a stark contrast to the millions of dollars of luxury vehicles usually parked behind my gates. The driver looked completely bewildered by the swarm of federal agents and police cruisers as he popped the trunk. Jerome threw his cheap canvas suitcase into the back and then turned around to look at me. Standing on the top step of the porch, looking down at him from my undisputed throne, he took one step toward me, his face twisting with a pathetic mixture of absolute grief and entirely misplaced anger, pointing a trembling, pathetic finger at my face. "You destroyed this family, Vivian," he rasped, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. "You tore us apart. You are a monster." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not even break eye contact. I just looked at the pathetic broken man who had spent 30 years making me feel completely invisible, and I delivered the final absolute blow. "No, Dad." I said my words perfectly, calm and razor-sharp, cutting through the cold night air. "You sold your home to fund a lie, and you sold your daughter's soul to protect it. I just foreclosed on your delusions." Jerome stared at me, his mouth opening, but no words coming out, the absolute undeniable truth of my statement, completely shattering whatever tiny fragment of denial he had left clinging to his fragile ego. He had nothing left to say. He turned around, his posture completely defeated, and climbed into the back of the cheap yellow taxi, next to his weeping, ruined wife. The cab driver slammed the car into gear, and the vehicle slowly rolled down the driveway, passing through the massive wrought iron gates, disappearing into the dark night, and taking the last toxic remnants of my abusive family history with it. I stood on the porch for a long moment, letting the freezing ocean wind wash over my face, breathing in the crisp, clean air of absolute total freedom. The flashing police lights were still painting the trees. The FBI was still tearing apart the guest house, but my estate was finally quiet. I turned around and walked back through the heavy oak doors, signaling for my security team to lock down the perimeter. The nightmare was officially over. I was just about to pour myself a well-deserved glass of scotch when my phone buzzed in my pocket, vibrating against the quiet fabric of my clothes. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen, reading a new text message from Richard Prescott, offering my crisis management firm a multi-million-dollar exclusive retainer. 3 months later, the dust had finally and completely settled over the absolute devastation of the Wilson family, and the reality of their new existence was a bitter, jagged pill they were forced to swallow every single day. The federal trial for Terrence was remarkably swift, primarily because the meticulous mountain of financial evidence I had handed over to the FBI was absolutely airtight. leaving his high-priced defense attorneys with nothing to do but watch him sink a devastating trail of offshore wire transfers. Shell companies and fraudulent accounting ledgers proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Golden Boy was nothing more than a common thief. 3 months after he was dragged kicking and screaming from the immaculate floors of my living room, Terrence stood shivering in front of a federal judge wearing a wrinkled, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that provided a stark and pathetic contrast to the custom Italian suits he used to wear while stealing from his family. He wept openly in the crowded courtroom, shedding genuine tears of terror as he begged the judge for leniency, trying to use his fading charismatic charm one last time. But the judge was completely immune, handing down a crushing 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary with zero possibility of early parole. The undisputed king of the family was now just another anonymous inmate locked inside a tiny concrete cell, stripped of his expensive hair, products, his silk ties, and his completely fraudulent superiority, condemned to spend the next decade of his life eating processed cafeteria food and staring at cinderblock walls, finally facing the severe consequences our parents had spent his entire life shielding him from. Lauren did exactly what a parasite does when the host organism suddenly dies. She completely detached and fled the moment the FBI froze all of Terrence's offshore accounts. And the national media caught wind of the massive embezzlement scandal. She filed for a rapid, aggressive divorce, claiming she was an innocent, naive victim of his sociopathic deception and throwing him entirely under the bus in a desperate bid to save her own reputation. But the elite high society circles she had so desperately clawed her way into were completely merciless. They stripped her of her social status overnight, whispering about her at the country club, turning their backs when she walked into a room and outright refusing to return her panicked phone calls, unable to handle the crushing weight of public humiliation and the terrifying realization that she was entirely broke. Lauren went completely off the grid. She changed her phone number, abandoned her luxurious socialite aesthetic, and moved into a cheap, cramped rental in a completely different state, hiding from the world out of pure, agonizing shame. Her entire identity had been built on a foundation of stolen money, and without it she was absolutely nothing, forced to trade her Cartier rings and designer handbags for a life of obscure, silent regret. But the most poetic and profoundly satisfying justice of all belonged to Jerome and Brenda. They had become officially radioactive, the very high society circles and exclusive elite groups they had worshipped their entire lives. The same people they had sacrificed my mental health and my childhood to impress, dropped them with breathtaking speed. The country club formally revoked their membership, citing the moral turpitude clause in their bylaws. The charity boards they sat on demanded their immediate resignations, and their so-called wealthy, lifelong friends treated them like a highly contagious disease. They had absolutely nothing left. No savings, no hidden assets, no luxury vehicles, and no golden sun to magically bail them out of their catastrophic failures. They were forced to sign a lease on a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying building situated directly next to a noisy, polluted highway. A depressing, squalid little box that smelled permanently of cheap cooking oil and damp, rotting carpet. Their entire identity, built on the fragile, arrogant illusion of extreme wealth, had collapsed into a pile of worthless dust. They spent their days trapped inside that tiny apartment, blaming each other for their monumental failures, screaming over the roar of passing semi-trucks, instead of listening to the gentle crash of ocean waves, completely cut off from the glamorous, elite world they genuinely thought they were entitled to rule forever. Meanwhile, the heavy, suffocating, toxic energy that had temporarily infected my beautiful home was completely purged, leaving behind a profound, crystal-clear serenity. The multi-million-dollar exclusive retainer I had accepted from Richard Prescott had elevated my crisis management firm to the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world, bringing in a flood of elite clients. But more importantly, my own personal world was finally, entirely my own. I walked out onto the expansive private balcony of my master suite, the polished teak wood, smooth and cool, under my bare feet, leaning against the thick glass railing and looking out over the breathtaking, endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The evening air was crisp and salty, carrying the gentle, soothing rhythm of the waves crashing against my private shoreline below. The massive estate was perfectly silent, completely free of Jerome's booming, arrogant demands, Brenda's passive-aggressive sneers, and Terrence's suffocating toxic entitlement. I held a heavy, crystal glass of 50-year-old vintage red wine, watching the setting sun paint the endless horizon in brilliant strokes of crushed violet and burning gold, casting a warm, triumphant glow over the magnificent home that I had bought and paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The absolute tranquil silence of the evening was interrupted by a soft, persistent buzzing from the small glass side table next to my lounge chair. I picked up my phone, looking at the bright screen displaying an incoming call from a completely blocked caller ID. I let it ring, simply, watching the screen glow until the call automatically dropped and a tiny icon appeared indicating a new voicemail. I tapped the icon and raised the phone to my ear, pressing play. The desperate crackling sound of Brenda's voice instantly filled the speaker. She was sobbing, a pathetic, wet, ragged sound that lacked any of the polished, arrogant superiority she used to wield like a weapon. "Vivian, please, honey," she wept, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered desperation. "It is your mother. Your father is sick, and the rent is due, and we have absolutely nothing left. We are so cold. Vivian, please, I know we made mistakes, but we are starving, and we need a loan. Just a small loan to get us through the month. You are our daughter. Please do not abandon us, we need you." I stood there on my private balcony holding the expensive phone to my ear, listening to the woman who had happily thrown me to the wolves, listening to her desperately beg for the very money she had previously mocked me for earning. There was a time in my life, a dark, insecure time, when that crying voice would have shattered my heart, when I would have rushed to save them and pay their debts, just to earn a single microscopic drop of their conditional love. But that weak, desperate girl was dead and buried under years of their relentless, toxic manipulation. I lowered the phone, looking at the screen, as the pathetic voicemail finally ended and the beautiful silence of the ocean returned. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, diamond-hard resolve. I tapped the screen permanently, deleting the voicemail, and expertly navigated to my settings, permanently blocking the masked number, so she could never reach my personal line ever. Again, I set the phone face down on the glass table, picking up my vintage wine and taking a slow, deliberate sip, the rich, complex flavors blooming on my tongue. The generational trauma, the endless suffocating cycle of abuse and unearned forgiveness, was finally completely and utterly broken. I looked back out at the magnificent glowing sunset, smiling a genuine, deeply relaxed smile, feeling the cool ocean breeze wash over my face. I finally had my beautiful beach house. I had my unstoppable empire, and most importantly, for the very first time in my entire life, I had absolute, unshakable peace. The greatest lesson to take away from this story is that blood does not automatically make someone family, and loyalty should never be demanded at the expense of your own well-being. True family is built on mutual respect and unconditional love, not manipulation or financial exploitation. When you find yourself surrounded by toxic individuals who only value you for what they can extract, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. Setting firm boundaries and building your own success is not an act of betrayal, it is an act of survival, because your peace is always worth protecting. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys of healing and self-discovery.